Welcome back. I'm Dan Aldridge, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Christopher Jones, CFO of Odyssey Marine this morning. As a reminder, please use the question button at the top of the video player to submit any questions directly to us to ask Chris. Chris will get into the details in just a quick second, but Odyssey is a fascinating company at the forefront of enabling the shift to a more sustainable future through the extraction of critically needed subsea minerals. And I did not do that justice at all, and so I'm going to turn this over to Chris to really give us an overview of the business, as most people really probably don't know who Odyssey Marine is. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you very much for letting us join you here today. So Odyssey Marine Exploration and Odyssey Marine Minerals really has been around for about 20 years, but has only been doing the mineral exploration business for about 4 to 5 years. It originally cut its teeth early days in being the preeminent deepwater shipwreck exploration company. You might have seen a handful of made-for-TV movies or the Discovery Channel where you've seen Odyssey really being utilized for these deep water wrecks, and notably finding some very sizable ones. And that was really their original core business. But at the end of the day, what they discovered was that they had a knack and a skill set for really exploring the true deep areas of the ocean, 4, 5, 6,000 meters. And no one does that better than Odyssey Marine. Dealing with some shifts in the marketplace and really seeing opportunity, the company was able to sort of shift over from that to the marine exploration business and started getting into initially phosphates off the coast of Mexico, but has now moved into the polymetallic nodule business. What we are there, as you rightfully say, we are at the forefront of what we think is going to be sort of the beginning of this energy transformation as we start to see more critical metals needed, and think more sensitivity about how those minerals are ultimately mined from a terrestrial basis.
So let's talk a little bit about the end markets, the customers that you guys serve, really how you're sitting on the forefront of that transition to a greener economy.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the ultimate customers are going to be the processors, but then at the end of the day, really the auto industry and the battery makers, right? And you'll see that today, the battery, even the auto industry, you see Tesla, Ford, GM, all in the last week or so in earnings reports have all noted one notable trend. That is, there is a shortage of critical resources to create or to meet the demand from their overall battery demand. And so that is ultimately what I think our end customer is. They're facing the biggest challenge, though, from really not being able to source those in a sort of a more responsible manner. That is you've got challenges with cobalt coming in from the Congo, or you've got nickel coming in from Indonesia, both of which are causing major issues for their supply chain.
So let's drill down on one of those, just to bring it to life for the audience, but it's a little bit more. Let's talk about cobalt, and in particular, how the extraction process works, explain what a nodule is, the different minerals that are in there, and how that extraction process is today, much more environmentally friendly than the antiquated processes of yesteryear.
You got it. So today, your largest cobalt mine actually sits in the middle of the Congo. And is utilizing what they call, a very nice term of artisanal miners, which really are oftentimes kids or teenagers that are, working through the narrow veins that are where the cobalt is formed. Certainly not a good thing, and certainly not a sustainable industry in the sense that cobalt demand is going to, grow by hundreds and hundreds of percent, or even 1,000% over the next several decades. From our perspective, and the way we look for it is polymetallic nodules. Polymetallic nodules sit at about 5,000 to 6,000 feet. And what we refer to the abyssal plains, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. We are fortunate enough to be a minority holder in a company called Cook Islands Cobalt, also known as CIC. This is a deposit that's about 220,000 square kilometers around the Cook Islands. And in this, the highest concentration of polymetallic nodules. Now, what's unique about the polymetallic nodules is that they're 100% utilized. That is, they have cobalt, nickel, manganese, iron, copper, and then some trace elements of rare earths. But then ultimately the substrate that bonds them together is also used in manufacturing, and more importantly for cement manufacturing. This is in complete contrast to the traditional terrestrial mining, where the vast majority of the material is what we refer to as overburden. That is, that overburden has to be removed, shipped, processed, and then is ultimately dumped into sort of overburden pits or whatnot. And so there's a massive amount of waste. And that's really the benefit here, is that there's zero overburden with a polymetallic nodule. And ultimately, you don't have the environmental impact of leach fields and things like that. that would ultimately be associated with traditional terrestrial mining. And so for us, what it is the engineering is that we already know the nodules are there. We know the propensity of those nodules is there. The bigger engineering challenge is being able to extract them in a commercial quantity from 5,000 to 6,000 meters, and then be able to ship them once we get them service to where we can ultimately process them. Those engineering items are being worked out, and largely we have several opportunities, but that's where we are in the process today.
So did get one question coming in from the audience with particular to the nodules. And so can you talk about, the kind of supply chain implications with that? How difficult is it to ship, to store? Are there additional costs or environmental implications in that area?
Well, listen, I think one of the things that just like any mineral extraction company, environmental is always something that we're very sensitive to. It's something that we need to be very cognizant of. And that's ultimately what we're going to spend the next 2 to 3 years monitoring to validate that we can do this in the most environmentally sensitive way possible. But once you extract the nodule, you bring it to the surface. But the supply chain will be you'll bring it to the surface. We'll be able to take them to a place like America Samoa, where we'll essentially what they call dry store them. For them, from there we have this very acute benefit of what we would call commercial tension. That is that if I was in whether it be the Congo or I was in Chile or even Indonesia or Australia, I would have no option other than to process my ore in that particular country. And so I'd be burdened by their tax rate, their labor rate, their energy costs, what other environmental challenges that they face. I have the benefit of being able to ship those nodules wherever I want, where I'm ultimately able to get the greatest factor. So if I want to send them to Australia because they want one thing, or the United States or to Mexico, I have that opportunity. And more importantly, I don't necessarily need to sort of recreate the wheel. I can use an old nickel processing facility, or even use an old smelting facility. Not that I would want to go down that path ideally, but the point though being is that I get that commercial tension. It does not disrupt from a supply chain perspective, and I can ultimately direct those nodules where they're most needed.
So let's put it in context just a little bit. How big of an area are we talking about, with cobalt, and then how does that then relate to the market as a whole?
So our deposit is over 210,000 square kilometers, right? So you think about that, that is absolutely massive. You can certainly see it from space, there as well. And you'll see some of that described there as well. We have a 20-year mining license, assuming that we get through all the environmental. We'll ultimately be granted a 20-year license for our location. If we were to extract that, we would more than double the world's known reserves of cobalt on this planet, from this. And that's just through the 20-year license. Now, we could probably continue to extract here for another 20 to 30 years beyond that. So we could, substantially meet and exceed the overall global supply for cobalt just with this one location in the Cook Islands.
So clearly it sounds like supply isn't going to be an issue if the extraction process is successful going forward. On the demand side, right, how much demand is there today, right? When you think about the EV industry, being kind of from a penetration standpoint, 2 to 3%. So long way to go. There's obviously not enough, supply now to meet the demand. And so with this deposit that you guys have identified, and with trying to get to, a lot of companies, have said by 2035, that every new vehicle that they manufacture will be EV. Is that possible, right, with this new find, or do we even need more beyond that?
It would be possible with this new find. There's nothing on the horizon that would ultimately meet this demand to be able to get to those numbers. It just the math does not pencil out. Okay. One of the things that's interesting is and one of the great things that's been happening is one of the things that has been important from an investor perspective is that 4 or 5 years ago, this has been something where if you'd talked to a mining company or a larger global mining company, they would have completely dismissed it. I would tell you that today we're starting to see greater and greater interest from more larger global mining companies who really have come to acknowledge that it's an eventuality that you're going to have to go down these paths, but it's more about a matter of when, not if. And that's certainly starting the interest that we're starting to see.
So let's shift topics a little bit. Obviously there's a lot of environmental implications here, but there's also some longer term strategic national security implications, right? And so think about what's going on right now with the semiconductor industry, and how Congress is trying to subsidize and support that to make sure that it happens here in the U.S. Can you talk about some of those same dynamics around rare earth minerals, and why it's important, for North America and other, democratically ran countries to have control over those resources?
That's exactly right. So don't think for a second that the Chinese and developers who are ultimately control things like cobalt were not involved in the licensing process in the Cook Islands and other polymetallic nodule locations in the Pacific. They certainly understand from a strategic perspective, their upper hand that they have here. So what was a very important part of the Cook Islands, and more importantly from New Zealand and the Five Tigers, if you will, that ultimately followed that strategy, understanding the strategic needs for these minerals. So that is of utmost importance, and certainly very important to the people of Cook Islands. But we certainly, that's one of the benefits of being able to have that sort of commercial tension, as well as we have the ability to ultimately move these resources to locations that where they'll be sort of strategically benefit and also be sort of strategically recognized there as well. And so that's really where we're seeing a lot of our increased interest, is understanding and being able to meet those strategic needs.
So let's talk about Cook Islands while we're here and drill down on kind of the life cycle of that. So can you walk us through, kind of the timeline, the life cycle of when you identify, a new plot, a new mine, all the steps that are required to actually get to extraction, to where we get to the nodules, to where we can actually support the industries that need them?
You got it. So just to be upfront, I mean, the Cook Islands licensing process and the process there has been actually going on for the better part of a decade. So we are actually getting to that point now. So about a year ago, Odyssey was awarded the exploration license, the primary exploration license. I think, based on environmental hurdles, between now and the next, 3 to 4 years, Odyssey is pretty optimistic, and more as well as CIC is optimistic that we can get to a point where, assuming that we meet the environmental thresholds and people are comfortable from an environmental perspective, that we can do this in a responsible manner, we could be doing trial mining in the next 3 to 4 years. So there is a possibility that you could starting to see on a commercial level extraction in these areas in sort of 4 to 5 years. Of course, here again, it's all sort of caveated with meeting those environmental hurdles, which are certainly very high. And so, I think it's important from a timeline perspective. A lot of the heavy lifting is already done. We're in the process right now of validating the resource. That is, will go down. And so, as I said, it's 210,000 square kilometers. One of the unique things about this, relative to terrestrial mine, is that when you do a terrestrial mine, what will happen is you'll have a vein. You'll do core samples, and as you kind of move away from that vein, the ore quality will degrade. One of the great things about polymetallic nodules is you don't face that issue. If I pick one polymetallic nodule up on one side of that 200,000 kilometers and from the other, they're 99.9% the exact same thing. So I don't ever face ore degradation. The one thing I do face is what we would call propensity. That is how many polymetallic nodules per kilometer do I have in terms of density. So what we're going to spend doing over the next 2 years is effectively mapping the seabed floor, with high resolution optics to essentially say, this is where the highest level of propensity is. And so this is where I effectively want to dig, or actually more like dredge, initially, where I'll just pick these nodules off the surface, creating the least amount of disturbance and being able to get the greatest amount of yield with effectively the least amount of sort of disruption to the seabed floor. And so that's really obviously very important, because getting the highest yield will be important, but also the least destructive and more impactful to the environment there as well. That'll take about 2 years. And once we get to that point, then we'll have a very good understanding of just truly the mass and the size of this overall deposit. And once, as I said earlier on, once we extract these nodules to the surface, then we have the ability to really redirect those nodules to where ultimately they're most needed.
Perfect. So another question coming in, from the audience, and obviously as you guys roll out and you discover different plots, there's a lot of fixed cost that goes in, and then there's the variable cost that comes out. And so can you give us a sense from a life cycle? Obviously you talked about long dated projects, but where Cook Islands is, we're a decade plus in, where are we to the point where cash flows start being realized and you start to have ROIC on some of the projects?
So from our prospects perspective, I would say that positive cash flow won't begin occurring for CIC's project until you get to commercial extraction, right? So at this point, it'll be done. You probably won't see positive cash flow another 4 to 5 years at this point. Now, that being said, there isn't the level of infrastructure investment that is required in this sort of in order to be able to meet that initial sort of level extraction. Like, we don't have to create huge amounts of processing facilities. We don't have to create huge amounts of extraction and handle that overburden, and huge tools to sort of mine the earth. That just doesn't exist. We need a boat, a couple boats that have these harnesses that go down, and as I said, they sort of pick up the nodules off the seabed floor. So you should look at each one of those boats in the sort of $200 to $300 million range. But if you think a traditional terrestrial mine would probably see capex in the multiple billions, we wouldn't even come close to that. And ultimately, we can sort of turn it on and off in the sense that once you have one or two boats, you can really start the operation, and then as you kind of build up momentum, you can use cash flows to generate that. That's assuming that we do it more on our own. My guess is that as we kind of move through this process and it gets further validated, you will most likely end up seeing larger commercial partners, sort of stepping in and wanting a piece of the pie and potentially a piece of CIC.
Okay. So obviously, as you guys expand, into new geographies and territories, you're obviously working across different, regulatory regimes. And so how do you get your arms wrapped around that and ensure that you're working with compliant partners and kind of safe haven environments?
Well, there's a couple of things that are important from that perspective. We, as a general rule, prefer to work in what we refer to as an EEZ. So an EEZ is an exclusive economic zone where we only need to deal with one particular government. If you work outside of the 200-mile radius of a particular country, you're in you're in sort of the area, which is an area is anything that's not within 200 miles of a particular country, but also falls under UN jurisdiction. So then you have to deal with 167 nations. Some of which are, very dependent on terrestrial mines, so aren't in any sort of big rush to ultimately approve any of these policies. So from that perspective, we prefer to work in the EEZ. From there, it's always very important that we only work with governments that are above board, and certainly ones who, that meet the requirements that are necessary to be from a commercial venture. And so we spend a lot of time getting there. Cook Islands is one that is sort of sprung from the New Zealand government structure, so of a Commonwealth type structure. So that's been very important for us. We've also done work in Mexico, which has obviously had some challenges for us in the past, and we're looking in other regions like Brazil. Listen, we spend more time worrying about political and sort of that kind of risk than we do anything else. And so I think that's something that is ultimately what the Odyssey's responsibility is. But it's certainly something that we're very sensitive to.
So sticking with cobalt, let's talk a little bit about competition, and to the extent that, who else is out there, what are the moats that you guys have, over competition?
So there's one other polymetallic nodule project out there of size that is made out there. Is a company called the Metals Company. I don't want to spend too much time. They are in a different region. They're up in what they call the CCZ, which is in the area that I was just talking to you about. I will tell you that their nodules are of a bit of a different composition and are more nickel and lithium rich as opposed to cobalt. And so that's sort of a different sort of model, but it sort of as a general rule has the same challenges relative to terrestrial mining. They have their own issues from a company perspective. So that would be the biggest one. And quite, candidly, not to sort of take shots at my competitors, they have some other sort of company issues that have sort of put a black eye on, I think, what I would say on the polymetallic nodule industry, which I think are unwarranted. Other than that, our other competition is there are two other smaller partners in the Cook Islands who are doing similar jobs that we're doing. They have a much smaller claim than ours. So I think, from our perspective, we were the ones that really have the most dominant opportunity from a polymetallic nodule perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so we're getting toward kind of the bottom of the hour. So this has been a fascinating discussion. I think we could probably talk for hours about the different extraction process you do. Before we leave, I do want you to briefly highlight some of the other minerals. So phosphate in particular, so the audience understands what you're doing there, why that's important and the problem that that's solving.
Absolutely. Well, the phosphate market is hugely challenging. That is, there's a lot of phosphate on the planet, though in some places it's very difficult to get to. The one thing that's important is that we have growing food security issues only that have been magnified by what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And so be able to access this and be able to have food security from a domestic perspective, phosphate is hugely important. Interestingly enough, phosphate cannot be chemically copied, so you cannot have man-made phosphate. It has to be naturally sourced. The largest sources for phosphate, I hate to say, are Russia, Morocco, and China. In terms of overall demand, obviously Russia is not exporting it, nor would we be allowed to import it. Morocco is the sort of one of the largest out there today, though, is in the brink of civil war with Algeria. And if that happens, you would have massive amounts of food insecurity because so many countries around the world rely on Morocco. And of course, China is not exporting as much, given it having its own issues, particularly COVID-based or otherwise. So you have seen phosphate prices go up exponentially here over the last 2 years. So there's a growing demand, whether it be domestically or whether it be in Brazil, Mexico, up and down Central and South America there as well. Odyssey cut its teeth on phosphate extraction with one of the largest phosphate deposits in the world was located off the coast of Mexico in the Mexican Baja Strait Peninsula. We are currently engaged with a longer tail lawsuit with NAFTA. I don't want to get too buried into that. And we can talk, that's another conversation, which comes to a head hopefully early next year. But the point, though, is no one on the planet knows as much about mineral exploration and phosphate extraction from a marine environment than Odyssey, having taken that project all the way to the point of commercial operation. We are now very far along in an operation off the coast of Brazil, very similar in terms of context, in terms of marine quality and quantity in terms of that. And we're also seeing other opportunities potentially off the coast of Africa there as well. The key being is that there's only increased growing demand for this. What's more interesting about it is that it's a proven model. That is that it's really just like dredging. So to the extent that you dredge New York or Hong Kong or Manila Bay, it's the exact same people, Bascalis, would ultimately be doing it. So we're not doing anything that hasn't been done before. We're not sort of recreating the wheel or creating anything new. But more importantly, we are answering what is only going to become a growing challenge for society going forward. And I think from our perspective, we think that we could have commercial operations going in Brazil within the next 2 to 3 years, and potentially earlier in some other regions as well.
I appreciate it. So Chris, thanks again for the time today. This has been fascinating to learn more about Odyssey Marine. I know personally I'm looking forward to following the journey and to see what happens as you guys move forward, because it's obviously key, for us being able to all live on this planet for a long time.
100%.
So thanks again. And for the audience, thanks for watching. Be sure to tune in for our next discussion with Tractor Supply CFO, Kurt Barton. Thanks again and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.